Deep Red is a giallo slasher film directed by Dario Argento. Marcus is a jazz musician who witnesses the murder of an innocent woman. The plot involves a clairvoyant, a failed jazz musician, and his mother. Howdy folks, welcome back to Garage Slasher-thon, where every day for the month of October we revisit a slasher movie. Today, second giallo on the menu, final giallo on the menu, because I don't want to review too many giallo movies. I'm trying to make it a varied list. We're talking about Deep Red. I remember in my teens I was kind of looking at Dario Argento movies because that's what a teen does. They look at the classic directors and try to watch movies from that director. And the first one I was exposed to was Suspiria. And then I watched Inferno. And then I was like, okay, let me watch Deep Red. And Deep Red is kind of like Dario Argento light. It's not as flashy as Suspiria and Inferno and some of his other movies. It's kind of him finding his footing, but it's still a very highly influential movie, and a lot of people liked it when it came out. I think this is the giallo movie that most people take note of when they talk about the genre, because it has all of those classic elements of giallo slasher movies, and then some. I think Dario Argento is a slasher king. He's awesome. I love Dario Argento. It's kind of interesting to see him now still being active. He released a movie recently and it bombed, and I haven't seen it. Kind of got turned off because the poster of the movie was a blatant ripoff of They Live, and it was called Dark Glasses, and it had the exact same poster of someone like this holding their glasses. And that kind of turned me off. But I did see him recently in that Gaspar Noé film, Vortex. So he's still doing stuff despite being an old grandpa. I will say that Opera is probably my favorite Dario Argento slasher movie. I think that one is just perfect. It's really on the edge of your seat. Crazy. It's like eerie. And this one doesn't come close to that movie. I remember when I was first being introduced to Dario Argento, Deep Red is one that I watched and immediately forgot about. Something about it just didn't stick out in my brain. So this is the second time I'm watching it. Did I like it more the second time? Well, stick around and you'll find out. So yeah, we talked about Blood and Black Lace, how it had all those elements of what you would associate with giallo. Sure, it has those very flashy colors. It also has themes of going against authorities, solving the mystery for yourself and not resorting to the cops, because Italy had a lot of distrust in authority figures following fascism in World War II. So it has all those themes. I will say that the bright lighting and the colorful lighting is not that present in this movie. It's something that kind of came later in his career with movies like Suspiria and Inferno and Opera, as mentioned before. But you can definitely feel the influence that this movie had on modern horror movies. The one scene in specific that really caught my attention is the first scene of the movie, where you have this clairvoyant that's kind of predicting a very gloomy future. And the scene itself really reminded me of Scanners by David Cronenberg, the famous head explosion scene. Just the way it was set up and the colors themselves, it really reminded me of that scene. And lo and behold, Cronenberg did admit that there was some influence from this movie when he made Scanners. Other than that, there's a creepy doll scene, and that was very reminiscent of the Saw movies with Jigsaw on the little tricycle. So a lot of horror filmmakers definitely saw this movie. It feels like a film noir. It has some horror elements to it, and I think those horror elements are just what grabbed people's attention. The film is basically a very paint-by-numbers film noir. I don't think the plot is all that interesting. I feel like the main character is pretty interesting. He's kind of a dick, and he's kind of proud of it. At some point in the film, he's paired with a woman journalist, and he finds out he has to solve this mystery with the woman journalist, to which he says a lot of misogynistic things too. He says that he doesn't want to work with women because they're too emotional, and this was pre-Andrew Tate, ladies and gentlemen. This guy's the OG Andrew Tate.
Women are weaker. It seems that there are some things which you just cannot do seriously with liberated women.
And then there's kind of a plot twist involving that. One thing that really stood out in particular is the use of beautiful sets in this movie. I feel like the sets are what's especially beautiful. There's like this whole street recreation that's obviously on a set, and it's very obvious. They're not even trying to hide it, I think. And in the background, you kind of see people at a diner, and they're not even moving, the extras. They are extras, they're not mannequins, but they're not really moving either. And it kind of reminded me of that Nighthawks painting where people are just standing around a counter. And the death scenes are what really grabs your attention. I think that's one reason why Opera always stood out to me as the better movie, is just because the death scenes in that movie are crazier. But this one does have its fair amount of crazy death scenes. One involving the jazz musician, where it's almost comical how he dies, because it's one series of events after another, and ultimately just gets his head squashed by a truck. And that's always a satisfying thing to watch in film, is when they put a dummy under the wheel of a truck and just roll it over the dummy. Always fun to watch that happen in a movie. His death scene kind of brought me back to last year when I reviewed Daughters of Darkness for the Vampire-thon. The girl in that movie had like a similar death where it's just like one thing after the next. It also reminds me of the Naked Gun movies, when the guy from Gilligan's Island falls from the building and then like a steamroller rolls over him and a marching band and everything ensues. And then there's this really cool necklace death where a woman gets like killed from her necklace getting hanged. And it brought me back to this movie that kind of freaked me out as a kid. It's not really well known, the movie, but it's called The Kiss. And there's this really freaky death scene where her necklace gets caught in the escalator and just clicks her. Yeah, that freaks me out. Basically, I'm still not that big into this movie. Just like I talk about with some of the other movies in this marathon so far, I kind of respect it for what it is. I respect it because it brought us Dario Argento. It's one of his first big movies, and he would later go on to make movies that I'd prefer personally. But also, the one thing that really makes me not like this movie, the one dated element, is the music. I was watching it with a friend, and me and my friend were just like so annoyed by the soundtrack of this movie, which is pretty surprising because Goblins did the soundtrack to this movie. And Goblins would later do the soundtrack of Suspiria and Opera and many other Dario Argento movies. Apparently what happened is that they had a composer at first. Composer dropped out. Then they wanted to get Pink Floyd to do the soundtrack of this movie. And obviously, getting Pink Floyd to do the soundtrack of this movie would have been very costly, so it didn't really work out. And they resorted to another prog rock band, Goblins, who agreed to do the soundtrack of this movie. Really weird how many filmmakers wanted to work with Pink Floyd, and it just never happened. We never got a movie scored by Pink Floyd. Jodorowsky's Dune is a documentary about the making of the Dune movie that never happened, and that's another instance where they tried to get Pink Floyd to do the soundtrack, and it just didn't work out. And it shows that maybe Goblins might have been a little rushed into making the soundtrack of this movie, because it feels very improvised, very last minute. The mixing, I don't know if it's just the copy I had, the mixing just felt off, and it just feels like fusion jazz, failed Frank Zappa kind of bullshit. It's really not that good. And again, I like that soundtrack in movies like Suspiria, but it just doesn't work in this movie. Completely rids the scenes of tension. That one scene with the jigsaw puppet, that's a really effective jump scare and a really creepy scene. But you just get that blaring fucking shit music coming out of nowhere, and it really kills the mood. I feel like a good soundtrack can totally elevate a movie. It's one of those things that goes unnoticed, is how important a good soundtrack for a film is. I don't think movies like Harry Potter or Star Wars or Jurassic Park, I don't think they work without the classic John Williams music. And just how it's important in elevating a piece, it can also detract from a piece completely. And I'm afraid that's what happened with this movie. Because on the surface, I don't think it's a terrible movie. I don't think it's the most compelling movie out there. Again, it's a movie I respect more than I enjoy, but that soundtrack is so blaring. Another scene as well is when he's like climbing a building and the music is just going haywire. You're like, what the fuck is going on here? I can't think of a movie other than this where the soundtrack kills the movie. It's really that bad. Okay, I shat on the soundtrack enough. I apologize, folks. Please, let me talk about what works about this movie as well. The camera work is really interesting. A lot of cool pans, a lot of cool dollies and stuff like that. I love it when a movie moves the camera a lot and doesn't just plant the camera in the same place. This movie's got it. I feel like this movie, having watched Blood and Black Lace and then this movie back to back, or not back to back, but very close, I feel like a lot of deaths were borrowed from that movie. Both movies have a death with burning people, both have a death with drowning people. Maybe it was coincidence, it's just something I observed. But I think ultimately, I think Blood and Black Lace is the movie that I prefer a bit more here, just because of those vibrant colors and the whole world of high fashion. This kind of explores like the seedy underbelly of Italy. You follow kind of this jazz musician who's kind of a scumbag, and meanwhile there's this other jazz musician who's very a failure at what he does, and he's a closeted homosexual, and it's just like about this kind of seedy underbelly in Italy, which is a cool contrast between the two films. One has like the high society angle and the other one has like the underbelly, which I personally found the high society one a bit more interesting, but it's cool to see the contrast between the two. Here's the other thing I didn't like about the movie is the twist really feels out of left field. So the whole thing is that we think it's his friend that was doing all of these murders all along. Turns out it wasn't him, and they killed him in a useless way. Turns out it was his mother, and his mother doesn't even play a big part in the movie, so when it is revealed that she's the killer, you're kind of just like, what? Which is a problem I have with most murder mysteries. A lot of the time, murder mysteries resort to the most unlikely outcome in an attempt to subvert audiences' expectations, and when you do that, it just makes it unsatisfying because you're like, okay, that felt a bit too random. Yeah, those are kind of the reasons why I think Deep Red didn't impress me the first time I watched it. The second time I watched it, I was a bit more familiar with giallo cinema. I did appreciate it a bit more on repeat watch. It had some really good set pieces, even though they were completely destroyed by that awful soundtrack. And I don't know how fucking controversial a thought that is. I'm sure a lot of people have this on vinyl, but I'm not one of them. Yeah, it just didn't work for me. Yeah, a lot of mixed feelings about Deep Red. Did you guys watch this movie? Comment below, let me know, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.